So I went to architecture school in the early 90s, and I remember the school sent me a supply list, and I think I bought every triangle and template there was at the time. All these analog drafting and model making supplies. And if I look back, the digital tools of practice are completely different between the 90s and today. These digital tools are always changing, but I think most architects will tell you that sketching and model making, they're still a part of their design process today. That part really hasn't changed much. And I just find making things by hand, the craft of it forces you to slow down and to think and to explore in different ways. And for me, it's often a failed experiment that's going to push the design in a new direction. These things are very hard to recreate and replicate in the digital environment. Design process almost always begins with a sketch. This is a conceptual sketch for a residence that I'm working on. And the idea that I'm exploring here is how this house can kind of amplify the site conditions of this place. Things like the weather, the seasons, the topography. And so I'm working with this really permeable exterior shell. And the idea is that in some places it dissolves to nothing, and in others it's fixed and permanent, but that it's always changing. Conceptually, the plan is organized around this shallow pool, this water element, and then the living spaces each relate to that pool in very different ways. And hopefully this is going to evolve to be reflective of and frame for all of these changing parts of this site. Now, this is not a fully formed idea, it's just a concept. And so to further explore these ideas, I want to construct a study model, kind of like a three-dimensional sketch. And then I'm going to use that as a presentation and design tool as I iterate and work through the next steps with my client. Base for the model is cut out of 1/4-inch masonite or tempered hardboard, and that sits on a plinth of thick cardboard. And here the cardboard is added to the bottom with hot glue so that it raises the model off the surface. This allows us to not only excavate into this plane if we choose to, so that our building has some sectional development, but also it gives me an easy way to pick the model up and maneuver it around on the table and really get my eye down close to it so I'm able to peer into the model and my face is not on the desk surface when I'm doing that. So that's just kind of a little hack here. So we'll set the model base aside and we're going to start working on building the volumes. The idea of model making for me is to kind of take advantage of this haptic connection between your hands, what you're making, all the materials, and really create something that you couldn't have predicted in a sketch. So I'm using this as a loose guide, but it's not set in stone, certainly. So I'm using basswood here. I like basswood because it has wall thickness that's sort of realistic with the scale that I'm working at. This is 3/32 scale. And I like 3/32 for these smaller models because they're easy to create, they're easy to manipulate and replicate. Doesn't use a lot of material. I have this little square here. This just makes cutting these things faster. So I'll do some layout based on the proportions that I'm working with, and then I'll just start cutting these wall planes. But I'm cutting out the two side wall planes here, and I'm going to try and render these as open spaces. So I have volumes which are more solid, but I also know that some parts of these are going to be more open. I expect this will spark new ideas. That's the whole point of physical model making for me. A couple of different ruler types you can get. This is called an alumina cutter. This has this kind of foam backing so that it doesn't slip around on the table. And it also has a guard to protect your fingers here. When I was an architecture student in my first year cutting, I had a cork-backed ruler like this, and I was a novice. And the problem with a cork-backed ruler is the blade can skip up and over this surface here. And so as I was cutting completely the wrong way. I was cutting like this, and my finger, it slipped up and over, and you can see I cut the side of my finger off right here, flayed it right open. So I use these because I've been using them for 30 years, but I can't pretend that they're the best tool. They do make this Aluma cutter now, which has this finger guard, so you have a strong steel edge. There's actually an embedded steel edge in here, and it keeps the blade from skipping up and over. I mean, it's not 100%, but it's definitely better than this kind of configuration. So 5 stitches later, it's all fixed. So good as new. Okay, so I have the basic components of these 3 volumes cut out. Now I'm going to start working with the lengths here, and I'm using the scale, so you can see this roof volume is 24 feet long, so that's going to cover this one. This other one is 24 feet long as well. You always want your ruler to be a little bit longer than your material, so you can start the cut from before you hit the material and follow through after it. Using a nice little square here. This is a machinist square. You can also measure both lengths on both sides of the material and then cut between your layout lines. That's another way to do it. And making multiple passes as you're cutting is much more effective than trying to bite through the whole thickness of the material in one shot. Now I'm going to cut the low side, and the low side here has to be our 2 feet tall. And if I'm cutting a long segment, I want to mark both ends and then use my ruler to cut between them. I'll use the Alumicutter here. The one thing I don't love about the Alumicutter is its thickness. It's quite thick. So it just means your blade has to be tall. And the foam keeps it from slipping. I think that the foam is actually more effective than the cork. The cork tends to get a glaze over time. Got that. A little bit messy there. You can tell my blade is getting a little bit dull, so I'll probably snap this off and get a new one. A lot of times they'll recommend in architecture school to buy the X-Acto number 11 blades, and I'm not a fan of those because cutting with a small instrument like this, they're about this size, tends to fatigue your fingers and your joints, whereas this is a gripping motion. So I just find this much more comfortable to use. So you can see I have two cutting mats. I've got a 12 by 18 here and an 18 by 24. And when you pair them together, they make this massive work surface. And then if you need to peel off and just use the smaller mat, say you're doing more detailed work, this can travel with you. Okay, so I've cut out the pieces that I need to start creating these shed roof forms. So we're gonna start assembling them. In terms of glue, I really like hot glue because it's so quick, but it can get messy. So just be careful there. So I'm gonna put a little bit of glue on that surface, and if any bleeds out, you can just be quick to wipe it off with your fingers. Okay, so we have our shed roof form. Now this is tiny, right? If I look at this in scale, this is only a couple of feet tall on this side and 7 feet tall here. So what I want to do with this model is really use this as a frame for the different spaces. So I'm working with a family of 3 shed roof forms, and I like shed roof forms because they have a directional component to them. So you can see the uphill side of this form suggests movement, suggests opening up to a view. If you place a window high in this wall, it lets light deep into the space. Cutting the roof like this allows light to shine to adjacent volumes. You can use a tall wall here to reflect light into a courtyard. So the shed roof form itself is a pretty versatile form. Now you'll see it's quite squat, right? 2 feet on this side, 7 feet roughly on this side. Really what I'm doing is I'm lifting this in the air by 7 feet, and then I'm going to start using kind of spatial divider blocks underneath it to suggest, you know, areas that may be more dense or may have partition walls, and then areas that may be more open. So in order to get this off of the ground plane, I need to create a surface that I'm going to mount this onto. And so this surface here is really going to act as kind of a rail for our sliding barn door partitions, maybe some exterior fenestration, windows, doors, things like that. And I've created the roof form, this plate form here, a little bit larger than the surface. And all I'm going to do is come in these corners and hit it with a little hot glue. This is where hot glue really shines because it's so quick to dry. And you can see that it's quite messy, right? But we don't care, because this is all going to be hidden with our roof plane. Okay, so now we effectively have our shed roof form on a plinth, and I'm really treating this like a track. And if you look in the sketch, you know, I'm starting to think about how this can be formed out of metal, or maybe it's a wood detail, but it's really crisp and clean. So we have our roof shape defined here. A couple other things we need. We need the floor plate, and the floor plate I've pre-cut here. I want to lift this off of the ground surface in much the same way that with our model base that we're lifting this off the ground. This is going to force us to really reconcile the transition zone between the ground and the building. And all I'm going to do is just glue on this little flat plate So I've pre-cut this flat plate here. Just glue that on. So now you can see there is some recognition that if we have say a deck surface or a walkway or some water elements, that can slip and slide beneath this. We need to reconcile that you're stepping from the site up into the building. Now we can start defining what the interior spaces are. And if we sort of reference back to the sketch, we have an area which is more dense. This is probably a more private space. Maybe there's a bathing space in there, a sleeping space in there. And then on this end of this volume, it's going to be more open to the site and how the sun and wind move around and through it. So to create these little blocks, you can go to the lumber yard, pick through their lumber stash and mill these down to your own specs. One hack is to go pick up a Jenga set, and I just pulled these out of a Jenga set we were throwing away. There are different types of Jenga sets. Some actually have really nice maple blocks, and you can see the difference here. This is a really beautiful block. These I think are poplar, but you can take these and you can mill them down to size like I've done here, and you can even paint them. So you can start suggesting, you know, there's maybe darker, denser areas in the floor plate. You can also go to the lumber yard and just pick up, let's say this is a mahogany block. Pick up a nice piece of wood, piece of cherry or a piece of walnut. You can fabricate, you know, these interior volumes, even exterior volumes, using different types of wood, and this can be suggestive of different types of material. So lots of options there. And all I'm going to do is just throw some hot glue in the bottom of this, and I'm going to set it in this corner of the floor plate. We can add this volume on top of it, and again, I'm just going to hot glue, throw a little dab of hot glue here. Doesn't have to be perfect. It's quick. If you were using wood glue or white glue to glue these surfaces together, the dry time would be quite a bit longer. So, you know, I can glue this in place and have a workable solution in less than 30 seconds. Okay, so now the last piece of this is to add the roof form. Now, initially, what I was thinking was to use a piece of basswood and make this whole thing kind of monochromatic. But you can see when I added this piece, it looks a little janky. It doesn't look finished or neat as I would expect it to. So I decided to use some of this sheet zinc that I had lying around. So I cut this little sort of roof form here. Now you can see if we just set it here and we're manipulating and moving the model, it's going to fall off. So the thing to do is just add a little cleat. I'm just cutting some of the scrap stock here. And you know, we can't hot glue this because the glue will not stick. So all I'm using is some Gorilla Tape. And this is just, look for something that bonds permanently to metal. So this is what I'm using for this. So I'm just going to cut a little strip of this off. And we're just going to find the side that's more appealing. I think I'll choose this one. Okay, so we place that on there. Yeah, it looks pretty slick, I think. An additional thing to think about with those dividers, you can start looking at using cast acrylic, and you can see this comes in varying opacities and thicknesses, and I've just milled some pieces down. It's a great stand-in for glazed areas, whether those are interior partitions or glass bump outs, and you'll see I'm going to use this on some of the other components here. Now I do want to start dividing this and showing how we might close this off and open it up. To do that, I'm going to start creating some barn doors, and you can see this is a piece of basswood that has a milled profile in it, and this comes in various sizes and flavors and shapes, and this is kind of a clapboard shape actually, but I think it's a good avatar for vertical boarding. You could use this for siding, you could use it for decking. The idea is just to suggest some material or textural change here. Now the sort of architecture student's hack for this would be to get some corrugated cardboard and just peel one face of it off. So if you get this real fine-grained cardboard, you can peel this off, and you can see it's not a bad avatar for what we're trying to create here. But you can see I've started cutting this into a barn door geometry so that it can slide in and out and across. And we're going to use this to start defining some of these spaces and start suggesting the idea here. It doesn't have to be completely realistic or accurate, but we're going to use it to suggest that. Now for gluing this, I'm probably going to use some white glue. It's going to take a little longer to set up, but it's going to be overall neater. And you can see that I'm mounting it on so that it looks like it's running on this track here, this piece that we're using to support our blocks and things. And then it's going to slide by the bottom floor plate of it. And so that's just a kind of a design gesture, that's all. Feels a little more finished to me. So then I'll go ahead and start layering on these barn door panels throughout the project, and we're going to use these to really suggest how this interacts with the site. But there is one of the 3 finished volumes. Simple, suggestive, but if this were carved out of a solid block of wood, can you imagine how different this would feel? Now you start to sense what the space is and how it starts to interact. Okay, so let's move this out of the way. Next piece I want to talk about are kind of these transition elements to the site. So I'm going to start creating these decks, and for this I'm going to use some of these skinny sticks, and these are just available at your local craft store, big box stores. They are basswood planks. I believe they're basswood planks. They might be maple. Very dimensionally stable. They have the perfect thickness. Now obviously this is not accurate and to scale for what a piece of decking would be at the scale of this model, but I almost don't care, because what I'm trying to do is, this is going to act like a sketch. We want to suggest the idea of a deck or an entry walkway without actually having to, scale, model, build every one of these. Now, of course, you could use something like a striated piece of basswood to achieve this if you wanted to, but I like these kind of plank little walkways, and I'm going to just set this up so that it, again, is lifted off of the ground plane. I'm going to create these spacers at either end, and you can use clamps to hold this together for you. And these little X-Acto clamps. This just allows you to get it all set up in place, and it's an extra set of hands. So for these little pieces of sticking, I like to get these sort of balsa sticks, and if you get sheet basswood, you can obviously cut this into sheets and create your own structural elements or beams, or just these kind of little gestural pieces, which are quite nice. But one little hack for this is to pick up a box of matches, wooden matches, and you can create much the same thing. Now you're going to be stuck with the dimensions of what a matchstick is, but you can see it's a pretty close avatar for what we're trying to do here. Obviously the length is an issue. They do make fireplace matches, which are quite a bit longer, so that's another option. Affordable hack for some of these framing elements. Here again, I could opt for hot glue, but here I'm just going to use some white glue because I think it's going to be neater, and this is just going to be set off to dry in the corner. The reason I use a small container is because it doesn't take as long for the glue to get to the bottom of the nozzle here, and then I just leave it sort of sitting on its side. 1 done, 2, and 3. Now we can loosen up our clamps, kind of set this off to the side, and that will dry. Now eventually we'll build a couple more like this. You can see this is going to fit off of the living area, and this will be another sort of connector deck piece too. So you can see we've got starting to develop our kit of parts that we're going to start collaging on the site. So let's take a moment and talk about vegetation, trees, things like that. You can always use wood dowels. You've probably seen this look before. I like using these super trees. You can see here, let's take one out. You can see the tree is very detailed. It has a beautiful shape, very organic and natural. It has some of these kind of little side growths here, which you can always pick off. I will just kind of come inside the center of the trunk, and you want to find an appropriate scale for your tree, whether they're young or old. And then you just kind of pick them apart. Get the shape that you want. And you're left with all kinds of different size trees as some of the waste here. So you can see the shape of that tree is quite nice. One of the things I prefer to do, rather than just gluing these around in the model base, that's certainly an option, is to cut a piece of chipboard, and then for this particular one we're going to do a regular layout of trees. So let's just say there's a total of 5. So I'll poke some holes in this chipboard at a regular interval, and then I can go ahead and plant these trees. So I'm just going to take the stalk here and cut a little point on it. You can just press that into the hole that you've created. And now you have a standing tree or a standing grove of trees. So I can add multiple trees to this. and we can then shift them around on site. So we're going to start collaging on the model base all the parts and pieces that we've fabricated so far. We have, for the main organizing feature of the plan, this water element. This is fabricated from a sheet of zinc, and this is simply a sample that I got from VM Zinc. This is anthracene, so this is the really dark black color. I've taken two balsa strips and adhered them with some double-sided tape to the back of that, and all that does is it just lifts it ever so slightly up off of this surface. You'll remember with the building volumes, we've also lifted those up. And this just forces us to address the ground plane and how we actually move from the ground up and into the building. Here we have a sheet of quartz zinc. And I love this zinc because it's easy to fabricate with hand tools. It has this nice velvety kind of organic feel to it. It's really soft. It's also representative of metal for the metal roofs, and it's just easy to work with, easy to bend. I have two retaining walls, which I've simply created out of strips of the same quartz zinc, and they'll sort of act to retain the edge of this water feature. Is this descriptive of actually how we're going to do this? No, but it's meant to be in the same way the sketch is loose. This is meant to be loose and open-ended. So as we move on, we're going to start adding our fabricated building volumes here. And so this is the principal bedroom wing, and you can see we've started to suggest that there may be a glass element that's sort of cantilevered out from the face here. We have our nice zinc roof. We have a little suggestion of a barn door and how this might slide. But you can start to appreciate that we're actually modeling the three-dimensional space. Rather than this being a solid mass, which is representing wall forms only, we are starting to open up the space to engage with the rest of the model. And that's really conceptually what the model is trying to represent. So by lifting this plane up and creating these interior, more solid volumes and these sliding planes outside, we're really illustrating the design intent. And that just helps us as we're discussing this with our clients. Three volumes here. These two volumes are facing south, so they're really capturing southern light, but then they're also letting light back into this part of the design here. We have some of our transition elements that I'll start threading in here. We have this little deck element which spans like this, and I really do want it to kind of overlap. There's this idea of these slipping axes and how these volumes slip along it. And then we have a deck that fits off the main living space to this side. So we'll just add this here. And then we have our entry covered walkway. And the entry piece here has been fabricated much in the same way as the entry decks. We have a sliding barn door, which we've used a little guitar string to indicate a sliding panel. And there's probably a column system that goes in here, but it doesn't need to be shown dead accurately. We're just suggesting how it might feel to enter along this axis here. And then we have a couple of lines of landscape elements. And I don't know if these actually want to be more formal like this, lined up in a row, or if they actually want to be more organic. And so I might do a version which is actually a little bit more organic. Now we're free to sort of slip and slide these pieces as makes sense. So this piece may move over here. This deck element may sort of slip back a little bit. This model, sum total, probably took me an hour and a half or 2 hours to fabricate because the volumes are so simple. You know, the gestures are simple. But I think that's the key with this. Keep it simple. Try and think about using and collaging materials from every resource you have. The hardware store is a great place to go and shop and think about how things can be repurposed and reused into model making supplies and materials. So the next step here is to take this and start building a three-dimensional model of it in the computer, and then we'll start translating some of these dimensional decisions into a set of digital plans, and we'll continue to iterate back and forth. So we'll take a step forward in model, and then we'll move to the floor plans. We'll then begin building elevations based on this information. We may return to this model and start tweaking the forms. This one big iterative process.